Hey Optimancers, Chris here. Okay, so I was busy over the holiday trying to come up with a more structured system for evaluating spells that I'm hoping to eventually talk to you about in video form. Since I think it's going to be a lot of spell changes that we're going to see in the 2024 Player's Handbook, and I certainly won't be covering them all right away, and I figured it could be handy for players wondering which revised spells they might want to try out right away and which they might want to hold off on. And I am still hammering out some details on that, but I am already making some discoveries. So I've done a lot of spell evaluations over the years, and I've given ratings and opinions on most of the spells in the game. Most of these spells I have a fair amount of actual gameplay experience with. There's still a few I may have used or seen used a couple times, but not often. And my method for evaluating spells in the past is pretty simple. Find another spell that does something similar, or at least has a similar function, and then compare them. If they do damage, compare the range, compare the area covered, compare the damage types, and maybe most importantly, compare the damage dice and the spell level. Which brings me to my non-random example, Firestorm. I've evaluated this spell before, but I haven't seen it used a whole lot in play, and I evaluated this spell poorly, and I want to start by explaining why. So first and foremost, Firestorm is what we call a blast spell. It's instantaneous, it does damage, and that's all it does. So, the details. It's a 7th level spell, so it's a pretty high level. It's available to clerics, druids, and sorcerers, and 2 of these 3 classes do not have a particularly strong selection of these kinds of spells. It does fire damage with dexterity save for half, and its area consists of 10 cubes that are 10 feet each, with each cube needing to be next to another cube, so your Firestorm might look something like this. The damage is 7d10, and that's 38.5 to each target on average. Not that you should expect to do 38.5 damage, because, of course, you're dealing with possible resistances and immunities, as well as a saving throw. We're also talking about a caster that's at least 13th level, which means we're facing more powerful enemies that are more likely to have those resistances, as well as things like magic resistance, meaning that full damage is even less likely. And there's not really any other 7th level blast spells to compare this with. There are other 7th level spells that do damage, but none that are instantaneous and only do damage over an area. So in my desire to compare it to something, I was eventually led to 5th level spells and Cone of Cold. Now, I've seen Cone of Cold used a lot. It's a pretty iconic spell, and I would go so far as to say it's a fairly common spell. I mean, even if you don't take Cone of Cold, if you've ever had a Staff of Frost, you've probably cast Cone of Cold. And Cone of Cold is okay. It's not a great blast spell, but it's not terrible. The area is pretty big, and it does 8d8 cold damage with a saving throw for half. 8d8 is 36 on average, which is only 2 less than Firestorm. I mean, Upcast Cone of Cold is 7th level, and it's 45 average damage, a lot more than Firestorm. And Cone of Cold does not have terrific upcast mechanics. A Cone of Cold covers about 78 squares on a 2-dimensional grid, while Firestorm is only covering 40, that's like half as much. Seems like the only real advantages of Firestorm over Cone of Cold are an area you can sculpt a bit and a better range. And naturally, next I compared it to Fireball, which is a good spell. And this might even be a more apt comparison since they both do fire damage and have dexterity saving throws. Again, the Fireball has a bigger area. It's 64 squares compared to 40, and I could match the Firestorm's damage by upcasting the Fireball to level 6, 1 level below Firestorm, and Fireball has worse upcasting mechanics than Cone of Cold. A 3rd level Fireball is a good spell. I am not sure a 6th level Fireball is. So, I wrote off Firestorm as a poor spell, and I haven't given it much additional thought since. Until very recently. I've been working, like I said, on a way to evaluate spells, and I kind of picked Firestorm at random to go through some of the points I had come up with, and I found some surprising things. So I am going to explain why I think I've undervalued this spell, and depending on DM interpretation, maybe it's even overpowered. So I'll start by reading the spell word for word. It's 7th level, 1 action casting time, 150 foot range, verbal and somatic components, instantaneous duration, evocation school, dexterity save, fire damage. A storm made up of sheets of roaring flame appears in a location you choose within range. The area of the storm consists of up to 10 10-foot cubes, which you can arrange as you wish. Each cube must have at least one face adjacent to the face of another cube. Each creature in the area must make a dexterity saving throw. It takes 7d10 fire damage on a failed save, or half as much damage on a successful one. The fire damages objects in the area and ignites flammable objects that aren't being worn or carried. If you choose, plant life in the area is unaffected by this spell. And to finish up, it has the damage tag and is available to clerics, druids, and sorcerers. So now I'm going to compare it with Fireball again, but this time I'm not just going to compare where it's the same, but I'm going to look for more details where it's different. First off, available to clerics, druids, and sorcerers. Only one of those classes normally has access to Fireball. Clerics get Flame Strike, which doesn't compare nearly as favorably. So does that mean Firestorm is better for clerics than for sorcerers? I would say it is. The same spell can have different values depending on the caster you give it to. But back to Fireball. A 20-foot radius is a good sized area. It's 64 squares. But is it actually better than the 40 squares of Firestorm? So let's break down the area. We have a range of 150 feet, and the 10-foot cubes must be located in that range. So although Fireball and Firestorm both list 150-foot range, I would actually argue Fireball has a greater range than Firestorm. Here's why. So with Firestorm, the cubes must be within range. But with Fireball, the 150-foot range is the furthest point you can center for the 20-foot radius Fireball, meaning the Fireball itself could extend up to 170 feet from the caster. So you can totally hit a creature 160 feet away with Fireball, but not with Firestorm. There's this bit here about placing the 10-foot cubes. It says each cube must have at least one face adjacent to the face of another cube. Okay, so with quick reading, I've always assumed this means you're making a chain, something like this. But this spell does not say these cubes have to be contiguous or in sequence. It just says one face of each cube must be adjacent to the face of another cube. So if I have two cubes like this, they both satisfy the requirement. So I could put two more cubes here. Again, both satisfy the requirement. So I end up with 5 10 by 10 by 20 areas of effect. So let's say we're in the middle of a fight and we have allies mixed up with our enemies, something like this. I can only hit one of these enemies with a Fireball unless I want to hit allies as well. But with Firestorm, I can hit way more enemies without hitting allies. Then again, Chain Lightning could hit 4 enemies with 10d8 damage, that's 45 average, with no friendly fire, and it's only a 6th level spell. But let's say the enemies are positioned like this. I can't get more than 1 in a Fireball or a Chain Lightning, but I could get 5 with a Firestorm. So, which spell has the better area of effect? And well, it depends. But I would say, based on play experience, I would say Firestorm has the better area of effect overall. And in a fair number of cases, it should be hitting double, triple, or more targets than Fireball does, while avoiding friendly fire fairly easily. So think about it this way. If a Fireball was cast at 7th level and does 42 points of damage to 2 creatures, is that as good as doing 38 points of damage to 5 creatures? We're talking about 82 total compared to 190. Less, of course, with resistances and saves, but those would affect both spell damages identically, since it's the same damage type and the same saving throw. Okay, so that is the area of effect, and I would say that I've underestimated the area of effect of Firestorm. But then again, I have not underestimated the damage to each target, and by 13th level, expending a 7th level slot, 70-10 just isn't all that impressive. But we're not done evaluating the differences between Firestorm and Fireball. It says the fire damages objects and ignites objects not worn or carried, and you can choose not to damage plant life. Here's what Fireball says. It ignites flammable objects in the area not worn or carried. Now I should say right now that I tried to find out what the mechanics of igniting a flammable object was, and I came up empty-handed. I think the idea is that your DM decides. So an unattended stack of firewood would probably become a bonfire. Well, a couple sticks would probably be turned to ash, but that's really up to your DM. But check out Firestorm. It also says it damages objects in the area as well as igniting flammable objects not worn or carried. Now, this does have actual mechanics in 5th edition. I'll also mention right now that spells that actually apply their damage to objects is exceedingly rare in the rules. It's one of the reasons I've grown to like Firebolt. I can actually use it to damage objects, or more specifically, one object. Firestorm damages all objects in its area. And although the damage isn't all that high, it is a heck of a lot more than a Firebolt. So this is from Chapter 8 of the Dungeon Master's Guide, Statistics for Objects. So we start with armor class, and you can see that cloth or paper or rope has an armor class of 11, while adamantine at the top has an armor class of 23, and it's irrelevant in regards to Firestorm since we are not making an attack roll. Objects just take the damage. I should also note as well that objects don't make saving throws, so there is no save for half damage. So here's the relevant text. It says that a huge and gargantuan object normally doesn't have hit points, and the DM can either just kind of wing it, or they can divide the object into larger, smaller sections, tracking each hit point total separately. Then it talks about damage types and says objects are immune to poison and psychic damage. Otherwise, the DM can just use their best judgment to assign resistances or vulnerabilities to certain damage types as they feel is appropriate. Finally, big objects like walls often have a damage threshold, which basically means unless they take a certain amount of damage on a single hit, they take no damage at all. If it exceeds hardness, it takes full damage. So if something has a hardness of 10 and you do 9 damage, you actually do 0 damage. But if you do 10 damage, you do the full 10 damage. As long as you at least meet the hardness rating, you can just ignore it. So just a heads up, I'm going to be doing a very minor spoiler for Out of the Abyss. So if you want to avoid that, then just skip ahead to the next timestamp. So here is an example of a damage threshold in an official publication. So here's the Svirfneblin or Deep Gnome City of Blingdenstone. It says, heavy stone doors reinforced with steel or adamantine are found throughout the Deep Gnome settlement. Unless otherwise indicated, a door in Blingdenstone has an armor class of 18, 40 hit points, a damage threshold of 15, resistance to thunder damage, and immunity to poison and psychic damage. So a Firestorm cast in Blingdenstone has a decent shot of destroying these stone and adamantine doors with a single spell. Now, I've been looking at every example of hardness that I've been able to find in published sources, and the highest I've found is a hardness of 20, which 7d10 should easily exceed. So I think, for the most part, we can ignore hardness. So back to object hit points in Chapter 8 of the Dungeon Master's Guide. Here we are. So from a minimum of d4 hit points for a tiny fragile object, to 5d10 for a large resilient object. In other words, Firestorm should destroy every object in its area of large size or smaller. No saving throw, it just happens. For walls, doors, floors, ceilings, well, then it depends on the DM a bit. But if they assign a hardness rating normal for the game, and then assign sections of these areas hit points as recommended here, well, then a Firestorm should destroy all of it. Everything in the area. Every wall, every ceiling, every floor, every door, and all other objects as well, whether they are flammable or not. Now just quickly, I'm going to remind viewers that the rules for huge and gargantuan objects, which most ceilings, walls, and floors would fall under, give the DM multiple options for handling how they would be destroyed. So a DM who doesn't want you blasting away the entire map has the very valid option of saying they're not going to use the hit point system for these things. Nevertheless, that was a massive oversight on my part when I rated this spell poorly. But there is potentially even more, though I'm going to put some dampers on this one. But Firestorm could potentially be absolutely and completely broken, depending on how you read it. So back to Fireball. Objects not worn or carried that are flammable ignite. Back to Firestorm. Same thing, but notice the first part doesn't have that restriction. Objects don't have to be flammable to take damage, nor does it say they need to be not worn or carried. Now, I want to make clear what the implications of this are. If your DM was to determine that your worn or carried items were to take damage from Firestorm, then that would mean that if your character was included in a Firestorm, you would make a saving throw for your hit points, but no matter what your saving throw was, you would simply go down your equipment sheet, armor, weapons, magic items, spellbook, gold, or other treasures, and erase everything. I only point out that the wording could be interpreted this way to show how broken it would be. Now I'm going to argue why it shouldn't be interpreted this way. Because although the game sometimes deliberately excludes worn or carried items as applicable targets, like it does for Fireball and for part of Firestorm, it also often doesn't. But that doesn't mean they aren't safe. Like, you can attack objects. There's no rule that says you can't attack worn or carried objects, but normally the shared understanding of the table is you can't attack and destroy your opponent's weapon. There's normally the shared understanding you can't just firebolt your opponent's armor and melt it. Even though the rules don't specifically forbid some things, the game stops working if you're able to do anything the rules don't specifically forbid. And when it comes to worn or carried objects, you have to apply the same logic, or again, the rules are kind of falling apart, as they would here if all worn or carried objects are just destroyed just by being in a firestorm. However, even with my assumption that worn or carried objects are, or at least should be, considered exempt, I have to say with a more detailed look at Firestorm, I have gained a whole new appreciation for this spell. 7d10 damage is still not much for a 7th level spell. In fact, I would say it's pretty low, but the versatility of plopping 5 sheets of fire around the battlefield alone is going to have some useful applications as well as doing damage to objects in the area. And the more DM buy-in as far as that goes, even with some rule support, being able to destroy things like floors and walls could be huge, and this could go from good to great. And if they do interpret that it destroys worn or carried equipment, then it goes right to broken. So how good is Firestorm? I think I have to say it's definitely better than my original evaluation, but it is hard to rate when there's so much possible variance depending on your DM. But I thought you might find that interesting, and maybe for some of you, you will be having a conversation with your DM about how they would want to handle this spell in your games. Anyways, for now, I'm going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks everybody, and I'll talk to you soon. If you enjoy the content on this channel, please consider supporting me through Patreon. A link to my Patreon page is in the video description. Today I'm going to be thanking my Thaumaturge level patrons. That's Airhead, Alex R, Vo, Bloody9, Atherazone, CJ, Chris C, Coral, Dank Train, Dewey Cheatham Howe, Douglas Reynolds, Eden the DM, Eric Wasserman, Evan Getting, FBKO5, Galad Artsy, Gishlife, Lightfoot, Heisenberger, Jay Gemmel, James Makla, James Sprague, Jean-Baptiste Blanchette, Jiriru, John Matera, Jonathan Zucker, Joseph Van Horn, Justin Times, Lars V, Mark D, Math Guy Dave, Mr. Brett, PCZ, Quicksilver HG80, Ramen Goblin, Scott Parsons, Sig, Speed Shadow, Thunderlock, and William Whittles. And thanks to all patrons supporting this channel.